Hey folks, for those of you that don't know me, I'm Sile. I'm the co-founder over at MetaView. Really looking forward to this one and to this series more generally. I'm a firm believer, and a lot of the team here at MetaView will be sick of hearing this, but a firm believer that you really need to witness greatness in order to be able to become great yourself. Um, of course, one of the problems is it's really hard to know how other great companies do the things that they do. We want to change that with this series. We'll be going deep into how some of the most amazing companies on the planet actually carry out the act of hiring. No better place to start than with Deel, one of the fastest growing technology companies ever. So really excited to have Alan on, and also pumped to be collaborating with Nolan on this. So two amazing operators that I think we'll all learn a ton from. Just a quick note on MetaView in case you don't know much about us. We're all about building AI superpowers for recruiting. There's nothing more important than recruiting when you're scaling a company. And during this AI revolution we're all witnessing, this really means recruiters and hiring teams suddenly have this opportunity to radically enhance the efficiency and quality of how they hire. Um, MetaView harnesses this capability for amazing companies like Deel, but others as well, like Brex, Quora, HelloFresh, and actually thousands more. We have a purpose-built AI note taker, an AI assistant, alongside uniquely powerful reporting capabilities that are powered by this cutting-edge AI. So if you haven't checked this out before, do head over to metaview.ai and kick off a free trial or get in touch with a member of the team. You can also connect with me directly on LinkedIn. I talk a lot about how AI is affecting TA and recruiting. But really, that's enough from me. Pump for this chat. Over to you, Nolan.
All right, thanks, Sile. Guys, I'm so stoked for this conversation and this series. If you guys don't know me, I'm Nolan Church. I was the 50th employee at DoorDash. I led talent there through about 800 employees. I was then the chief people officer at Carta, and I now run the HR Heretics podcast. So this series is actually something that I wanted when I was in the talent seat. And part of the problem is that everybody's so busy. Our networks are limited. Even when we do go out to coffee with friends, we're only getting a little slice into how people recruit. And so when me and Sile were talking about brainstorming about this topic, I thought that the thing that I really wanted, you guys really want, is to understand how the best companies in the world recruit. So today we're going to start with Deel. And I said this in my note on LinkedIn, but if you guys don't know, Deel is one of the fastest companies ever to achieve 100 million in annual revenue. And so we have Alan Price, who is their head of talent. Alan, we're going to get you in 1 second here. We want this to ultimately answer your questions. And so in the LinkedIn Live, please drop in questions there. I'm going to spend like the first 30 to 40 minutes asking my questions because I'm really curious about how Deel hires. But drop your questions in there. And for the last 15 to 20 minutes of the conversation, we will go over to the LinkedIn Live and we'll answer the questions from there. All right, Alan, it's awesome to meet you, man. You said earlier you're calling from Amsterdam, yeah?
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, in Amsterdam. I've been in Amsterdam for about 9 years or so. So yeah, it's a cool city.
Amsterdam is a dope city. Okay, so let's set some quick context for the audience. How long have you been at Deel, and how many people was the company when you started?
So I've been at Deel since the 1st of April 2023, so just a little over 18 months. And the organization size was about just over 2,000, so 2,200, 2,300, something like that.
Is that what it is today, or is that what it was when you started?
That's what it was when we started, and then we're
Okay.
about 4,500 people year to date. So in that 18 months.
So you've hired like more than 2,000 people in 18 months.
Well, it's currently about 2,000 net new in addition, but
Got
the
it.
total hires would be a little bit more than that.
Okay. And then what is the breakdown of full-time employees and contractors? Obviously, like Deel helps you hire people in different countries. So how do you guys think about the breakdown between FTEs and contractors?
We think about it in like a number of different ways. Like, it really depends on like the footprint, the role type, and all of these things. I don't have the specific breakdown or details around the split and distribution between that. Um, I think it's also important to differentiate. We only my team only hires for our internal staff versus external facing kind of roles, right?
Got it. Okay. And then how big was the talent team when you started versus how big is it now?
The talent team was about 33, 34 people, something like that. But like the structure was like we had kind of recruiters, right? And there was no real there's a few managers, right? Maybe three or four managers or something like that. But yeah, the weightings, the organizational structure was a little bit off where it is today.
Yeah. So what I think you're saying is like a lot more people that are actually doing like individual contributor recruiting today. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yep. Makes sense. That's what everyone's doing. Okay. So you told me before this call that you guys are hiring 250 people a month, which is just nuts. I want to start with like the hiring and talent philosophy. How do you guys think about what a great hire looks like at Deel?
Yeah. So I think first, number one, I think it's like our whole mission and purpose is about providing great quality jobs, irrespective of borders, right? So historically, if you look at San Francisco or other places, you have to relocate to like the Londons and New York and San Francisco's to work on like the cutting edge kind of technology. And if you were based in another country I won't name, but you may not have the same affordability to access to these highly paid or skilled jobs, right? So I think that's part of our talent strategy to break down barriers or break down borders to access talent and great jobs. So when we think about that, it's about kind of a distributed workforce. So we have employees in over 100 countries in different parts of the world, right? So I think like access to talent is kind of number one. That drives our philosophy of and that's partly the reason why we do so many hires and so many interviews. We typically tend to see between like this year we're on track to do about 1.5 million applications this year, and we're going to hire probably 2,500 people, right? So when you look at it from a ratio perspective, I was speaking to a head of talent at a bank, and they were doing about 6.5 million applications for 95,000 hires. So when we're doing 1.5 million for 2,500, like the ratios are a little bit off, right?
Yeah. Okay. So that actually that gets into like one of my initial questions for you, which is when you think about the breakdown of hiring. So obviously you guys have, you're expecting more than 1 million applicants this year. So that's our inbound channel. How do you think about like outbound and agency, and what percentage of the makeup is, if is it between inbound, outbound, and agency?
Yeah, so it's a fraction of a percent for agency. Like there's not really a channel that we use at all. We've got a huge referral program that contributes to about 22% of all of our hires.
Wow.
So that's yeah, half the hires come from inbound, so a touch more. And then you've got a sourcing activity that is makes up the remaining quarter, right?
Okay.
So that's really the breakdown. Yeah, that's really the breakdown.
And when you think about allocation of resources for outbound sourcing, how do you given that your team is small, every talent team today is doing more with less. How do you guys think about which roles get sourcing priority? And then who does that sourcing? Is it your team? Are you guys using some sort of like AI associated with that? Or are you asking hiring managers to help? What does that look like?
Yeah, so it really depends on kind of role type. So we've actually designed a lot of our role types. So role types as a recruiter could mean a number of different things, depending on what group we're hiring for. So I'll give you a couple of examples, right? So you've got like a full stack recruiter, right? A full stack recruiter does sourcing, they do interviews, manage the pipeline, manage stakeholder relationships, kind of all of these things, like full cycle, right? Then you've got an outbound kind of sourcer, right? So mainly focused on top of the funnel. Where we typically tend to use them is on pipeline roles. So take, for instance, a back-end engineer. We have 70 or 80 back-end engineers that we need to hire. So we have dedicated teams, and what their role is to outbound, reach out to the candidate, have that first conversation, tell them about the organization, tell them about the design. They then push them through into the hiring manager and also code review. Once they pass code review, it goes through to a recruiter, and the recruiter will then take them through the process and organize that whilst also managing kind of stakeholder relationships, which points to the third type of role, which is a generalist kind of recruiter, but is like a pipeline recruiter. We call it like evergreen, right? So those are the folks who aren't doing sourcing, but they're coordinating and dealing with the funnel of candidates that come through, and they get the inbound from sourcing, right, or from application review. So that's typically the three main differences. So we typically tend to see like the inbound, outbound recruiter in our engineering kind of worlds. If we think about our revenue hiring, so our sales folks, then it's typically kind of full stack, right? So you do sourcing, and you also do like the inbound piece as well, everything tied together.
Cool. And when I was at DoorDash, just given that we were a very lean team as well, very low margin business, one of the things that we had to do was we had so many roles open and not enough people on the recruiting team to help with outbound sourcing. We actually had our hiring managers help with sourcing activities. Do you guys expect your hiring managers to help the recruiting team source for niche roles?
It really depends. We get a lot of referrals coming through, so I think that kind of helps us. I think it's really important outside of that to have a methodology of everyone is a recruiter, right? It's not the recruiter's responsibility to hire the job. Ultimately, the business need is that there's work to be done, right? And if you outsource recruiting as a hiring manager, then I think you're going to potentially kind of get into some problems, right? So the methodology is everyone's a recruiter, and then you've got different levels of insight. I know, our CEO, our COO, Dan, for instance, does some sourcing himself, right? And so the leadership team do their own sourcing, and they kind of connect with candidates that they want to speak to, and then we help facilitate some of the coordination around that, as well as driving it. We see managers. We use a lot of like hiring manager seats on LinkedIn. We kind of look at programs. They do a lot of sourcing kind of themselves. I think, I'll give you one example. At the start of the year, we were looking at hiring a huge amount of sales folks. So we said, well, hey, like our conversion rates and our funnels mean that we're not going to get to the volumes that the business is kind of demanding that we need to get to. So then we worked with the sales managers. They would do their own sourcing. We would also be driving a lot of the candidates through. But in terms of recruiter screens, we would say, okay, well, manager, we're going to skip the recruiter screen. You're going to do the recruiter screen.
Yeah.
Right. And then we would distribute that workload. So I think there's a number of different ways in which you can plus and minus your capacity model. And it doesn't always have to be this traditional way of like recruiter screen, hiring manager screen, all of these things that can potentially slow down the process or put concrete on the funnel, right? I think you need to have some elasticity towards that.
Yeah, my two big takeaways from that is like, one, everybody's a recruiter. And two, when it's literally coming from your COO who's doing outbound sourcing, right? That expectation to hold everybody accountable to everybody as a recruiter is so much easier.
Exactly.
Let's get to I want to actually go to like the next step of the process, which is more into assessing candidates. So do you guys do any like non-traditional assessment practices? So things like work trials or cognitive testing or behavioral assessments?
In part. So, firstly, how we think about skill-based evaluation. For us, it forms kind of four main categories, right? You've got your functional skills and practices, right? So if you're a software engineer, like Node, Java, et cetera, or practices around kind of agile or waterfall, whatever it is. Right, so those are your functional skills and practices that are grouped as kind of one. Then you've got your behaviors, right, and how it links to kind of your cultural values and how you kind of communicate and collaborate together. That's number two. Then you've got some of your achievements, like what have you shipped? What have you done in the past? Right, and then there's a category of like motivation, right? So why are you looking to join this organization? Is it because of X, Y, Z? And everyone have their own motivation. And it's not about assessing and saying, well, this motivation is right or wrong, but it's like, well, how do, does that align with our culture, and what are they looking to get? And if we're really interested in that candidate, how do we kind of tailor our message back to why should you join, right? So those are the four main categories. You then start to have a look at what skills do you assess, when do you assess, how to assess, who should assess during those interview processes, and then design the process around, well, hey, these are the top 10 things that we want. Let's make sure that we test and evaluate through that process. There's various kind of enablement activities around a knowledge base, like a Wikipedia, internal Wikipedia of resources for how to interview, right? And also question banks, materials, questioning techniques, et cetera, et cetera. So that's how we think about it in terms of methodology. I think that it's still a kind of a work in progress. It's not really a refined model that we've kind of perfected, right? I think that we're on that journey. When we look at we also have to be very mindful of not every single evaluation can be done on video during an interview, right? Because it's our volumes are just so high, right? So if you've got 1.5 million applications and you're progressing 5% of them through to the next stage, right? That's 75,000 recruiter screens you've got to do. You factor that in to how much time that then takes. You factor the coordination work, you factor all of these things. It's just a huge amount. And then because of that, you're not going to be dedicating a lot of your time to proactively going to the market and sourcing and doing all of those type of things, right? So there's some AI that we use around CV review, right?
Yeah.
Quite frankly, there's some AI that we use around skill-based evaluation. So, for instance, there's a platform that we use that you can plug into custom-based questions, or even you can select role type, and then it will answer 5-6 questions or themes that you want it to ask, and it will be a virtual interview with an AI assistant, for instance.
Really?
And then it takes five, 6, 7 minutes or so to evaluate the response. And then from that, you can have less candidates coming through to the funnel, but then more meaningful interactions once you get that candidate through the funnel. Because otherwise, when I first joined, I think it was, I mean, no disrespect to the team, but I think it was more like a sausage factory, right? How do you get these applications? How do I interview? How do I kind of get candidates through the funnel? Let's go, go, go. And then you get your product at the end, right? And I think we need to think more eloquently about, why does the role exist? What is the business objective, and why do we want to get out? What do we want to get out of it? But also, what are the current skills? But also, equally, what are the future skills of the organization? I think those are some of the questions that we're continuing to ask ourselves.
Okay, so you're primarily trying to solve the scaling challenge. What about for like the very niche role? So I was like looking at your job site before today, and I think there was like a role that reported to your COO. I think it was called like Ninja or something like that.
Ghostbuster.
Ghostbuster. Okay, that's what it is. Yeah. Okay, so for that role, right? That's not a volume-based role, right? So how are you thinking about bifurcating between, what is mostly this like 95% volume-based problem, and then this like on the other end of the spectrum, hyper niche, N of one type of candidate?
Yeah, I think that team's really interesting in terms of like the origin and how it's kind of set up and all of these things. Ultimately, it's a role working on special projects, right? To be able to, I mean, like other organizations would probably call it like strategy and planning, right, or something like
biz
that.
ops.
But biz ops. Yeah, but I mean, we do have a biz ops team, but this is like special projects which work directly with the COO and CEO, right? So it has a little bit more exposure potentially. So you either you start to evaluate and look at what are the skills, what is the problem we're trying to solve. You evaluate the skills that you're looking for, and you have to be very intentional on that type of role. You can't just kind of interview 10, 15, 20 candidates and kind of like filter it all down, right? You have to be very intentional in terms of what is the profile you're looking for, what are the experiences that they've had previously and achievements that they've had, and ultimately being able to kind of really kind of refine and look into what is the functional skills and practices, behaviors, all of these things, and be able to say, okay, intentionally you either put that role into two teams, right? We also have an exec recruiting team who do the low volume, high complexity roles.
Got it.
Right. So we're also kind of building that out. But equally, there's recruiters who have a high degree of business understanding and relationships. They know exactly what they're looking for. So you need to reduce a lot of their work scope in order to give them more of the time to go into those low volume, high complexity roles. So there's always a balance between different teams. There's depending on seniorities and all of these things, between the low volume, high complexity and the high complexity, low volume stuff, right? So
yeah. So you basically, what I'm hearing is like we have like a separate team that focuses on those like niche roles, and they're doing more of like the they're not focused on the high volume side of the business. They're focused on like these very niche, hard to hire roles.
Yeah, but as a philosophy, that role specifically, the Ghostbuster role, is actually kind of working in our business as usual kind of recruiting team, because our recruiters who just have such a high degree of understanding around that team in terms of the origin of the prior teams, and then why this team was then created, so they know perfectly what they're looking for. So it's actually kind of, whilst it's a complex role, because of their high level of business understanding, they're able to knock it off quite quickly.
Okay. I want to take one more question about assessment, and then we're going to get into some other things. So you have a pretty hot take on Halo resumes, which kind of actually like made me feel a little bit exposed, given my background. So I guess like one thing is like, can you explain like what your take on what is a Halo resume, what's your take on it, and then how you guys think about hiring for trajectory versus hiring for experience?
Yeah. So listen, I think that, experiences are great. But just because you've had that experience doesn't necessarily mean you've got those functional skills or practices in order to execute, right? So just to give you a bit about my background, when I first kind of went in-house, I used to work at Google, then I worked at Uber, then I worked at Wolt, which was sold to DoorDash for pretty sizable amount. I think it was like 8 billion by the end. So again, like I've worked at these kind of Halo organizations, but what you recognize is that, just because you've worked there doesn't mean to say that the hiring bar is just like perfectly high everywhere, right? There's always people that do better than others at every single organization. So it's about, what are you actually looking for? Like, yes, experiences can play a part, but it's not just about, prior experiences. It's also about ways of thinking. It's also about situations, situational, behavioral, and kind of skill-led kind of questioning, right? So I think, I'll give you one example. So in our revenue team, right, generally speaking, across the organization, there is a preference towards, well, hey, if they've worked at a prestigious organization such as LinkedIn or other places, then hey, this is selling to the HR community, all of these things, right? So, but is LinkedIn a must-have product versus a would-like product? And actually, when we ran analysis around around the must-have product versus would-like product on sales, we see a higher correlation of folks that, when selling a would-like product, they actually kind of outperform their peers in the must-have products, right? So actually we see a negative correlation of folks, not to say that it's true, but like when you look at the average across multiple data points, you tend to see that, the top performers don't always come from the larger organizations. But I do think there's a bias and a preference towards, when you design your interview panels, you look at the LinkedIn outreach. Have they worked at this big organization? Are you outreaching to the smaller organizations? No, you're not. So that's not hitting your funnel. Then when you look at the CV review is biased towards the larger organizations, right?
Exactly.
And then, so you're filtering out negatively a lot of your top talent that would otherwise kind of, when they get into the seat, actually kind of do well. So for us, it's about objective-led interviewing. And that's where I think a lot of organizations need to kind of pay attention to, right? And when you do that analysis, then it's quite interesting when you look at the trends, which some trends you expect and some trends you don't.
That's okay. So what I love about what you just said is actually something that we realized at DoorDash as well, which is hiring managers want to use a shorthand code, which is, oh, they worked at XYZ big company or great logo. And it turns out when you do the analysis on who your top performers are, that's what I'm hearing you say. It's like you do that analysis and you come with that data to say, actually, it looks like our top performers have a much more diverse background set than these,
Yeah.
large companies.
Yeah.
And that is the way that you influence hiring managers and interviewers to be more open on where candidates are coming from.
Yeah, exactly. So I think like just one example. So we looked at like our sales development representative kind of hiring, right? And we saw more and more, we want more experience, we want more experience, we want more experience, right? Because then these folks can come and hit the ground running, there's kind of faster ramp, blah, blah, blah. Right. But actually what you tend to see is that there's not necessarily just that's a perception. And when you look at the data and you look at the actual performance and the attainment, um, that data the data just doesn't ring true, right? It's a very similar ramp across everyone. But when you are hiring for more experience, then the general path from an SDR goes to an AE, right? An account exec. But if you've got more experience, you're wanting to get to that path a lot faster. And when you actually look at the return on investment, if you're doing, let's say, kind of 12 months in seat before going towards an AE, you've got 3 months of ramp, you've got 9 months of productivity, and then you go through another 3 months of ramp again when you go back into an AE role. So out of 15 months, you've got 6 months of ramp, right? So actually, when you start to look at it like that, you're like, well, hey, like, is there better ROI mechanics if we were to do things, a little differently, right?
Yep. Okay. So I want to transition and talk about hiring decisions. And so, take me into, we've now interviewed, call it 10 candidates. We've done our debriefs. I want to talk about like how you guys do the debrief process, who makes the hiring decision, and then is there any like accountability or follow-up on that decision to look at quality of hire?
Yeah, I think this is an evolving thing that we need to do. So listen, right now we don't do a debrief, right?
Oh, interesting.
Yeah. So, and that's partly why, like, we're very, we've been a customer of MetaView for a little while, right? And I think we actually start to use a lot of that data to be able to kind of influence kind of hiring decisions based on some of those recordings that we have. I think that we are geared up towards kind of speed. Like it's you do have if you're at the start. Well, when I first joined, we were hiring like 125 people a month. Right now, it's 250 and rising. So we needed to really kind of ramp up in terms of the speed of hiring. So we don't do a debrief. I think that there are a lot of value and a lot of reasons to do that debrief around kind of the hiring decision, but also the no hire decision, right? And just making sure that you don't hire that soft yes candidate kind of through the process. So I think that we will be evaluating that. We haven't yet kind of pushed that through, but I do think that that's something very interesting for us to evaluate, look, and consider. In terms of kind of quality of hire metric, I think most organizations are struggling, right, with that quality of hire metric in terms of, you could get that data and you could see it reasonably, but like at what time period do you get a reliable data set? Is it after 3 months? Maybe, maybe not, right? It's probably not. So then it's like, well, hey, a lot of organizations looking at about the 12-month mark. But then if you're 12 months behind in terms of that data set,
lagging indicator.
How relevant actually is it? So, I think there's certain permutations around that we have to look at and evaluate. But I think like quality of hire is kind of in some organizations potentially kind of done okay, but in the majority of organizations, I'm not sure it is.
I agree. I still think it's like the white whale in recruiting that no one has actually like quite figured out how to funnel it back into the recruiting process in a timely manner.
Yeah.
Like I still think most companies are really struggling with that.
Exactly.
Who makes the hiring decision? Is it the hiring manager?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then is there a check and balance on that decision? So like, is there some sort of like offer review approval? Like, does Alex, your CEO, sign off on all of these, or what does that look like?
Yeah, so there's a couple of checks and balances, right? So every functional head has to sign off on that decision. So if you're a hiring manager, for instance, and then you need to go up to your functional leader in order to kind of get that kind of fast approval, right? Let's go. then every offer, you know, it's got its pros and cons, but every offer is still approved by Alex, right? And I think that that's also, you know, very much a kind of a founder mindset. I'm actually, you know, it has pros and cons, don't get me wrong. But in terms of, you know, having someone, a CEO who's so invested in our talent and so invested to want to actually look at the minute detail of of these type of things is actually really interesting versus having, a disengaged kind of CEO, right? So who's kind of a little bit too far removed. So I think the pros do outweigh the some of the efficiency challenges.
Look, I actually think that that's a positive. It kind of feels
Exactly.
like
Yeah, me too.
it feels, most people think it's a pain in the ass. And, it turns out for me, so with Tony at DoorDash, he interviewed every candidate. I think it was up until like 500. Like he was breaking for a long time. And then we transitioned over into offer review, and he had to approve every offer, because he's the CEO of a $1 billion company. We ultimately had to put you have 24 hours, Tony, to approve this. Otherwise, we're moving forward, and, may your opinion rest in peace. But I found that when Tony actually pushed back was one of the most effective calibration tools on hiring managers and interviewers. Because we as recruiters, we can push back a ton, but sometimes the hiring teams just don't listen to us. But when it comes directly from the CEO, and especially if it's something that we had said, like, hey, we're going to want to flag this, we're going to want to better assess this certain thing, I find it actually provides us air coverage into ensuring that we are keeping the bar as high as we say we want to keep the bar.
1,000,000%. Fully agree.
Yeah, I love that. Okay. Let's talk a little bit about let's talk about tools. So what tools are you using right now? And I would specifically want to focus on AI. I feel like every recruiting team is getting pressure from their leadership team to have some sort of AI strategy. And, outside of MetaView, for me, I haven't seen much. So what is your AI recruiting stack?
Yeah, I think, listen, we're evaluating a lot, right, on this. So we've done a number of different things, right? So number one is CV review is massive for us, right? So we ran so firstly we started so we're on Ashby, right? So Ashby just launched a new AI tool,
Right.
et cetera, for inbound things. But prior to this month, there was no AI tool, so we used an outsourced we used a pilot kind of provider to look at kind of a bot to be able to review CVs internally. We saw that it was like a 95, 96% kind of filter rate. So we'd only have to look at 5% of candidates,
Wow.
right? So bearing in mind, we're getting 30,000 applications a week, right? And be able to reduce 95% of that was game changing for us. So that was number one. It also had the outbound capabilities to be able to go and look at the bots and then be able to automate and look at profiles on LinkedIn and to be able to kind of give you a list of folks, right? And then you can reach out to them and then it would deal with the automated kind of response with these things. And then we're able to efficiently book calls in people's diaries. That was a pilot, right? It wasn't kind of fully rolled out across everything, but that was really interesting for us just to see the game-changing capabilities that AI could generate for us. Obviously now Ashby just launched a product. We're excited to scope that out further. It's a lot newer, but it's very interesting on our side, which was a feature request that we were asking for months, right?
How does the Ashby tool compare to the tool that you were piloting?
I think I need to reserve judgment on that for the moment because
still in the oven.
It's still in the oven. Yeah, exactly. Nice phrase. So on the CV review, I think that's really interesting. I think the outbound piece, if it's a combination of both, obviously Ashby don't do outbound, right? So I think we need to consider and have a look at what our capabilities are there.
And when you
Then,
say
as I
outbound
mentioned,
specific, what specifically you mean, right, is like, okay, great. This thing filters 95% of the candidates out. So we're only looking at the top 4 to 5% of candidates. And then in addition to that, when we go and look at those, we just press a button and then it kicks off the process with the candidate. Is that what you mean?
no. Let me explain. So there's three capabilities of like what I'm seeing in the market on the top of the funnel. One, it filters out candidates, right? So you get 95% kind of like filtered out. Number two is it filters in candidates. So if they've applied for a back-end engineer but they're more of a full stack engineer, for instance,
Oh,
then
interesting.
that will be able to automatically pivot into that new pipeline, right? And then if you launch a new role, immediately it will come up with 50 plus candidates already on your database that are potentially kind of interesting and relevant. They've applied before and they've been matched and they've got a high percentage match. They will be one of the top 5% for this role that you've just launched. So you've got a number of different quick wins on that piece. And then thirdly, what I talk about in terms of outbound is it goes outbound, i.e. an AI sourcer to go outbound onto LinkedIn and other areas and be able to proactively outreach to the market of candidates who you don't know.
How effective is that outbound sourcing piece?
Um, it was quite effective. Like we ran a couple of trials, and it was quite effective. I think we need to still scope it out a little bit further, but indeed, it's very interesting. I think that for us, the skill is listen. It's a human contact sport at the end of the day, right? So, how can you make things kind of efficient, right? Definitely from if you're filtering in candidates that are already on your database, you still need to have like recruiters really, really managing that relationship and really prioritizing that candidate experience and bringing them through through that kind of stressful time, quite frankly. If you're changing jobs, it's stressful, right? So you need to, that's where the skill of the recruiter is. So you want them to be
Yeah.
building relationships with our candidates, not like automating kind of roles, right?
Yeah.
So I think that, it's helpful, but you have to also make sure it's still a human contact sport, right?
Okay.
And then yeah, like this is really interesting from like a talent pipelining kind of perspective as well, right? In which then you're still able to then have that type of recruiter, which is out there. Like we don't have sources that just generate lists, right? We have sources who manage that first contact, speak to the candidate, tell them the proposition, where are the opportunities within the organization, pass them through to interview. And then if they pass that first interview with the hiring team, then that's when the handover period kind of occurs, right?
Yeah,
Whereas
that's it.
previously, yeah, the
I think
handover
it's
is a lot
really
earlier.
interesting. I think it's really interesting to have a tool that's able to say, hey, this person applied for a back end role, but actually we like the tool believes they're a better fit for the front end role and it's automatically making that adjustment. Like that's a game changing feature.
Yeah,
That I think that if you have high volume inbound, that feels like a must have tool going into the future.
1,000,000%. Because yeah, even when you look at kind of AEs, right? AEs, maybe it's sales, but then they move into kind of account management, and then they move into customer
Yeah,
success, and then they kind of move
exactly.
back into AE, and so you've got a blended skill set. And like our careers, if you think about them, are blended, right? So it's also really interesting, and it's also able if you're able to like plug in like what are the typical moves that people tend to make. Especially for our world, like a lot of recruiters move into an account executive role a few years later, right? After going through that SDR route, or potentially even just going directly into that AE role. So, we're not in swimming lanes, right? You can still kind of change sport as well.
Okay. Okay, that's really interesting. So let's talk a little bit more about other AI tools and maybe specifically MetaView. How do you guys use MetaView, and what do you guys think are actually like the most important features that you're using very often?
Yeah, so I think when we decided, like we evaluated the market, obviously, I was excited at what Sal and the team were kind of building. Um, I think our bet in terms of like going with MetaView stems from the fact of it's not about the features today that exist, and the features are great by the way, but it's also about the mindset and what features are coming or believed to be coming in the future, right? Because I think so that for us was part of really the value proposition and kind of why we wanted to kind of partner with MetaView, right?
Yep.
Now, in terms of like, you know, in terms of the features, I wasn't that interested in the note-taking kind of piece, right? And I mean it. It's not as if it's not valuable. I think that's like a, a gateway drug, right, into actually getting folks into actually using the tool and seeing the other features and benefits, right? So for us, when we think about it, when we think about what skill to assess, when to assess, how to assess, who should assess, like we're we're designing a whole program around. We're calling it like Elevate, right, which is basically a our play on raising the bar, right? So so our Elevate program is about what are the current and future skills? How do we evaluate those skills? Who should evaluate? When we should evaluate? How we should evaluate? Right? And for us, what was really interesting was opening up the black box in terms of how interviews are completed. Right? And we
Yeah.
see a number of different things that come out of it. So one is obviously the efficiency in terms of kind of being able to refer back to quality notes versus, yes, move forward and like two or three things about the questions that they ask, but you don't really get that context. So, when we talk about quality of hire, how relevant is that data 3 months, 6 months into the future? It's not, right? So it's impossible to be able to say, hey, we thought this person would be good, but how do you do that based on inconsistent data sets and varying data sets? Every single, even if we look at feedbacks, every single feedback looks different to the next, right? It doesn't always follow the same kind of rigor and format, right? Um, uh, so 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 being able to open up the black box is really interesting. Number two is like the enablement capability to be able to kind of do coaching, right? I think
Exactly.
is like
Yep.
really interesting. So when we're launching this Elevate program, not only are we doing like a knowledge base of resources, right, to refer back to an internal kind of wiki page on TA. But you've also then got what we call like Big Dot Training, which is our internal learning management system. So you're able to do distance-based learning, but also you've then got the live interview trainings, right? So that the combination of the three enables us to drive an Elevate hiring program. But secondary to that, you've also then got the follow-up of the interviewing. If you want to interview better, then it's like after the call is a call to action. Submit 3 or 4 interviews that you've completed using the techniques that we've taught
And
and
then you're
taught you
doing
over
quality
time,
control.
and then you're doing quality control, and then it's really interesting
Yep.
because I think a lot of people like turn up for an interview and then 3 weeks later they forget half the stuff
Totally.
and it doesn't really embed to that. So actually that was part of elongating all of our strategy to be able to interview consistently well over time, and then if there's certain things that we're not living up to standard, then we're able to act quickly and see with our own eyes versus wait for candidate experience surveys. And then when you get that report, it's kind of 3, 4 weeks later, whatever it is, and then you're not able
Exactly.
to meaningfully kind of access. So I think that was really interesting for us. And again, like the future, what I kind of think is going to be interesting, especially in this space, is you've got such a rich data set when you look at the transcript of everything that's being said, right? For us in TA, we look at situational, behavioral, skill-based kind of questioning, right? What are the ratios between each of those different areas? How are we assessing? And then being able to, later being able to develop very sophisticated mechanisms to be able to report and analyze what were the 10 skills that you were interested in,
Yeah.
and were they actually evaluated,
Yep.
right? And then was there probing questions, was there follow-up questions, all of these things and behaviors that you want your interviewers to have. And if some of the features may not exist today, I struggle to understand in 3 to 4 years, are they going to exist? And I would probably think they would be. So I think it's just an evolving marketplace. And I think TA teams TA leaders are potentially going to get behind, going to get left behind if you're not doing some of these things, because you could really see dramatic implications in terms of TA and more broadly the people team
Yeah.
having a very significant seat at the table, right?
Totally. And the two things you talked about is what got me excited is one is the quality control on interviewers. Like before, we had no idea what was happening in these conversations. And then two, with that quality control, you can drive more business accountability. So look, it's the
100%.
business. The business is the one that is interviewing these candidates, right? They're telling us, they're helping us figure out what questions to ask, how we can, and ultimately the only way to get better over time is by basically doing an archaeology session. And you can only do an archaeology session if you have the data. So I love that. Okay, we're about to transition over into audience questions. I have actually one more question, which is how you report the talent team's performance to the leadership team. So I guess like I'll first start with cadence. Like, is there some sort of cadence that you have between you and your exec team? What are you guys discussing in those meetings, or is it async? And then what are the things that they care about and they're driving you on?
One of the really interesting, so we've got like three main kind of OKRs, right? One is the candidate experience, one is volume of hiring, and one is kind of launching our Elevate program. Those are the three key components of that. What I think that, you know, leaders or managers at a variety of different levels care about is not necessarily like time to hire, right? But, you know, pace to goal, right? So for us, we think about, well, hey, like, you know, how many requests do we have, right? How do we build our capacity plans kind of around that? And ultimately we kind of lock to a number, right? So that number this quarter was like 600 that we needed to hit, right? And we're going to do 700.
Sorry, 600, 700. What number are you referring to?
So 600 was the ask of what we needed to hire this quarter.
Okay,
and we're going to hire
yeah.
and we're going to hire 700. So how we think about that in terms of pace to goal, right? So it's how many AEs do we need to hire? How many SDRs? How many kind of engineers, et cetera, et cetera. And you can break that down into actual kind of role requirements, right? And then what we then look at is funnel conversion. So if we look at, well, hey, like you need 10 recruiter screens to one hire, for instance, or 12 recruiter screens to one hire for an engineer, or 15, whatever the numbers are, then you can then start to plot out and say, okay, well, we need to hit this objective. Therefore, this is the funnel that you need to hit. So then it becomes, you know,
You're building
for
a model.
instance, yeah. So for instance, it's you need to have 12 recruiter screens that have been completed. In order to get those 12, you need to have 150 applications coming in and then the 5% conversion rate, et cetera, et cetera. Do we forecast within the next 2 weeks we're going to get 150 applications? How do we then kind of integrate that with sourcing models in order to kind of top up, right? So what is the plan for every single vacancy when we look at our top of funnel activity? And then it's about conversion numbers. So recruiter screen, team interview, hiring manager interview, kind of final interviews, et cetera. And then we actually have the live data based on what our activity is, and then it also then forecasts where we're going to be. So at the start of the quarter, I can predict with a degree of accuracy, and it's probably played to about 3-4% of
Wow.
like where we're going to be. So I had confidence in the number when we're saying, hey, we can probably overachieve the 600 number. I was able to forecast out very easily at the start of the quarter versus waiting 1 or 2 months in and then being like, hey guys, final push. Yeah, let's get these candidates kind of locked in and closed, right? So that pace to goal and funnel conversion rate is something that we clearly pay attention to.
Yep. And so what is the cadence of your communication with your CEO? Do you guys do like a quarterly business review or like a monthly review? What does it look like?
Yeah, we do quarterly. We do a mixture of monthly reviews and quarterly business reviews with each of the different departments. Depends on the size of the department, obviously, because if you're a smaller department, then there's a slightly different kind of more of an async. But if it's a larger department, then it's the monthly and quarterly kind of business reviews. Um, uh, we we also have like automation in terms of like the reporting, like and the reports, et cetera, et cetera. I think you know. You have to base it on like priorities. I think we tend to like jump into the fires and jump into the weeds when there's topics that come up on a kind of a weekly basis, and then we educate and kind of adjust from there. But mainly, a lot of those that pace to goal is done at kind of functional head level.
Yep, cool, makes sense. All right, let's transition into the audience questions, and I actually love this first one around internal mobility. So you guys are a couple thousand people right now. How do you guys think about internal mobility, and what percentage of your hires are coming from folks that are already in the building?
Yeah, it's a good question. So I think one of the benefits is I think our internal mobility team is pretty stretched, right? Because it's not just about role
I
type
bet.
changes; it's also about country changes, right? So we care about time zones, but we've got a number of our sales folks that live in Barcelona supporting the Benelux region, or in, XYZ country, like in, so you can be working on a rooftop in Marrakesh for a week here. Like, we don't really kind of mind too much as long as you're doing the job, right? So you can be based anywhere. We have no hub location. So you tend to find people say, hey, yeah, I've been living in the Netherlands for a couple of years. I actually want to live in Spain for a couple of years. And then maybe I want to go and live in Portugal. And maybe I want to. So there's that type of
Got it.
modality, in terms of, like, maybe they're not even changing role, but they have that freedom of movement, which is a unique benefit to coming and working here. In terms of kind of mobility, then we have a number of different programs. So you've got very clear programs and career pathways from going from an SDR to an AE. You've got the quarterly kind of mobility. We tend to look at that on a quarterly basis, but also we encourage people to apply for roles internally. And if you've got that institutional knowledge, then you're able to have wider impact in different areas and different functions. I'll come back to you. Let me have a look at the distribution of external versus internal hiring. Let me see if I can get that
Yeah.
by the end of this call.
Cool. Yeah, it's such an interesting question for you guys. I hadn't thought about the country mobility, which is pretty interesting for folks that are trying to either get promoted or move into different organizations. Do you guys have some sort of rule on, like, you have to be 9 months in the seat or something like that?
Yeah, it's 12 months in seats, and we have performance evaluation every quarter. So
Yep.
we have two main ones at the mid-year, end year, and then you've got different check-ins at in the other 2 quarters. So performance is evaluated
Wow.
every 3 months, and yeah, I mean you know that gives, it's not just building up towards the end of the year and that's the big piece. And then if you miss it one year, you're kind of,
Hmm.
then it's a problem for the next year, right? So there's a lot more kind of check-ins and a lot more modality that folks can do.
That's interesting. So just really quickly on that topic, because now you've piqued my curiosity. So for every quarter, are you guys giving out ratings every quarter?
Yeah.
That makes sense.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
it's light touch. Some of them, like, obviously, like end of year and like mid year, a little bit more in depth, and then you've also got like more light touch kind of check-ins. But yes, we do. Yes, we do ratings, and we're also going to give feedbacks, etc., and encourage managers to have those quarterly conversations, right?
Yeah.
So career planning and career pathways are, so that's one of the value propositions, right? If you want to join an organization, and it's growing like crazy, then you also want to have that personal growth and also kind of review your nature of work over a period of time, right?
Yep. Okay, that's really interesting. The next question from the audience is the DEI strategy and how you guys think about DEI. And I will actually just like start to say what I think is most interesting about you guys is, given you're a global organization, there's already some inherent diversity from location, right? So it's not like you're only hiring in the United States and only hiring from major metropolitan areas. You guys actually have the benefit of being able to hire from across the world. So how do you guys think about DEI?
1,000,000%. We see, yeah, we've got workers in over 100 countries, right? So by
Wow.
default, that has a innate area. And then our client base, our clients, we're in I think operationally we're, 130, 140 kind of countries, right? So our workforce should reflect our communities in which we support and serve, right? And it's not like Deel is, a software tool or a service for tech organizations, right? We have a list as long as your arm of different startups, and they could be and enterprise organizations and everything in the middle, in a variety of different industries. So it's not like this tech play, right? You've got like mum and pop shops as well, right? You've got retail stores, you've got software offices, but you've got manufacturing. You've got, like, the list is pretty vast. So from a diversity perspective, we do have that natural gift. I think there's still some pockets, especially if you look at kind of engineering, for instance, and kind of uh, the different kind of groupings around, some challenges around kind of engineering. If you look at, if you look at the amount of females, for instance, within our engineering organization, would love to have a better split, being completely
Yeah.
transparent. I do think that there's certain mechanisms that we can do to drive it, and we really feel very passionately that our bar, especially when you like, is very objective as opposed to
Yeah.
bias led. But there's still plenty of work to be done. So I'm not saying everything's perfect, but I do think we have that luxury to be
You
able
do.
to break down barriers for international talent.
Yep. Okay. I want to get to two more questions in the last 4 minutes. So one is around the Elevate program, and it's specifically around split decisions and how you guys handle split decisions. So actually, what I'll say at DoorDash, the way we thought about this was the expression Tony used was he expected the somebody on the panel to put their badge on the line.
Yes.
And it sounds a lot worse than what it is, but basically it's like, hey, you can fire me if this hire doesn't work out. Like, we didn't actually fire people because people make mistakes, but we wanted people to feel incredibly passionate about making the hire such that they would say, I'm putting my badge on the line for this hire. How do you guys think about split decisions in interviews?
Banging the table, right?
Exactly.
So it's a very similar, and that was very similar. If everyone's a soft yes, then it's a no.
Yes.
And that's no. It's I think that I feel very passionately about that. I would rather, and I say this to the TA team, I'd rather not hit our hiring targets and make the wrong hire, right? If we know that there's question marks, there's flags, but we're pushing it through just to make a hiring number, that's the wrong approach that we need to do, right? And also, I think honestly, it like resonates, especially where you have to get that leadership kind of buy-in as well, to review that offer packet at the end and just make sure that everyone's comfortable to move forward. And then there's a degree of kind of banging the table, right?
Yep, totally. Okay. Last question is actually around subjectivity in hiring. So specifically, I think what this person is getting at is specific like skills and modalities in interviews. So specifically, like any particular studies, research, like personal experience highlights. Is there something you guys do or don't do as it relates to like individual skills and expertise as you're assessing?
I'm trying to understand the question. Maybe you could rephrase it a touch.
They said subjective. I think what we're getting at is objective.
Yeah.
So basically, I think what they're trying to say is like, how do you actually like know you're assessing for a specific skill? Like, how do you get to the lowest level of detail to like try and get to the answer of if they are good at this thing or not? Like, what are you guys doing there?
Um, for us, it's about kind of, one of the methodologies that we're using is like star AR, right? So being able to evaluate questioning. But I think the AR piece is really interesting. And a lot of people just know STAR as like situation, task, action, results, but they don't know the AR piece, right? And the AR piece is alternative action, alternative result. So if we were to then kind of, which is basically like digging deeper questions, right? Or 5 why or whatever it is. So when you start to evaluate and you say, okay, well, this was a situation I had to hire 100 people. These were the actions that I took. This was the ultimate result. It's like, okay, but what would you do differently? What alternative actions would you do? Why did you choose this versus doing this? Like, what did your top of the funnel look like? Like, how, if you, how would you, what alternative actions would you do? And then what alternative outcomes and alternative results would you then have? And it's really interesting on some of those things. Say, oh, well, actually, I would do this differently in the future. It's like, okay, but do you think that that would then get the result that you're actually kind of looking for? How would you measure that result? And it's really interesting. So that for me is like the digging deeper piece. So that star AR I really agree with it from an evaluation perspective.
I love that. That's such a great framework for follow-up questions. right?
Yeah.
And asking people like what alternatives they would take, and then how they measure it, what they think the outcomes would be. That's
Yeah.
really
And then,
really good,
and
Alan.
then, and then you can really get someone in terms of like methodology, because like sometimes you say, oh, well, um, you know, I would do this differently next time. It's like, okay, but why would you do it differently? And
Right.
is that the outcome that you're actually gonna actually kind of get? And it's a theoretical conversation
Around
around,
second order
okay, well, how
thinking.
would you, yeah, exactly. Yeah, it's for me, it's really powerful.
I love that. All right, we are at time. So people can find Deel at Deel, DEEL.com. They can
Yes.
find you and me on LinkedIn. They can find Sile on LinkedIn. And then if you guys are interested in MetaView, you can check it out at metaview.ai. So Alan, thank you so much for the time. Thank you for taking us to school.
No worries. Thank you very much.
Thanks all.